They say every home carries its secrets. Some are whispered about in kitchens, others buried under layers of dust and shame. But there is one family, one house, that carried something darker than silence. Its walls were not built on foundations of love, but on the collapse of bloodlines, on the quiet decay of morality itself. When you walk into that place, if you dare, you don't just see poverty. You see faces that don't quite belong to themselves, eyes that don't follow the rules of nature, jaws and brows reshaped by the weight of generations collapsing inward. This isn't just a story of hardship. It is a story of a father who laid beside his daughter, of brothers who shared more than a roof, of children born into a world where their very existence was a crime against the natural order. Imagine the stillness of night in rural America, the silence broken not by laughter or the comfort of family, but by something else, a ritual, a cycle, passed down as though it were inheritance. The father, the man who was supposed to guard innocence, instead defiled it, and what followed was not a single sin, but an entire bloodline entangled in itself, collapsing like a dying star. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones, but none dared to intervene. What they saw were people who looked like shadows of humanity, misshapen, half-present, speaking in sounds that seemed closer to echoes than words. And yet, behind their deformities, behind their strange stares, lay the truth. Every face, every crooked smile, every vacant gaze was evidence of a family tree twisted until it became a knot that could never be undone. This is not Europe's old aristocracy, where royal bloodlines intermarried for power. This is America's forgotten backyard, a house of flesh and bone where inbreeding was not hidden in castle walls, but out in the open, concealed only by isolation and fear. Fathers beside daughters, mothers beside sons, children born with the burden of their parents' sins etched into their very skulls. And when outsiders finally stepped inside, what they found was not just disturbing, it was unforgettable. A living nightmare, breathing and staring back at them. This is the story of the most inbred house alive, a story you were never meant to hear. The family lived on the fringes, tucked away where roads turned to dirt and the world stopped caring. Outsiders rarely ventured near, and when they did, they spoke of it only once, as if saying the name too many times would summon something unholy. Children with slack jaws stared from behind rotting fences, their eyes not curious but hollow, like windows with no one inside. Some had twisted spines, others carried jaws too large for their faces, and many walked with the gait of bodies that had forgotten how to be human. But what unsettled most was not their appearance. It was their silence. They did not speak like other families. Their words were fragments, sounds strung together without order, more like cries than language. It was as though the family tree had grown so tangled that even language itself could not escape. The father was the root. He had started the decay by crossing a line that should never be crossed. He took his daughter into his bed, not once, not in a drunken mistake, but as though it were his right, his ritual. From there the chain could not be broken. Brothers lay with sisters, fathers with daughters, sons with mothers, and each child carried forward the collapse, one more generation lost deeper into the abyss. By the time strangers came to witness them, it was already too late. The blood had folded in on itself too many times. What stood before them was not just a family, but the physical memory of sin. You must imagine what it feels like to walk through a home where every glance reminds you of what should never be. A room where a young girl lies awake listening for footsteps, not knowing whether they bring protection or violation. A boy watching his sister bear a child, only to realize the father of that child is also his father. In such a place, innocence is not lost, it is never allowed to exist. And through it all, the father's presence loomed. Ms., a man who did not see daughters or sons, but bodies, instruments to continue a cycle that had no end. The neighbors whispered, of course. They saw enough to know, but in places like this, silence is easier than confrontation. It was safer to pretend nothing was happening, to call them strange, to laugh nervously when one of the children wandered into town, dragging a twisted leg behind. No one wanted to be the one to expose what was happening in that house, because once you knew, truly knew, you could never unsee it. The house itself told the story as much as the people inside. The roof sagged under years of neglect, the windows smeared with grime as though even the glass was ashamed to let light in. Inside, the air was thick, not with warmth or the smell of family meals, but with something sour, stale, almost animal. The floorboards groaned with every step, as if the house itself resented the weight it carried. On the walls, there were no photographs, no memories framed with pride. Only peeling paint and shadows that seemed to stretch too long. It was not a home, but a tomb where the living moved like ghosts, chained not by death, but by blood. Each child was a reflection of the father's crime, a living relic of choices that should never have been made. Their faces bore the unmistakable marks of generations folded inward, sloping foreheads, eyes that pointed in directions the mind could not follow, mouths that could not form words with clarity. To see them was to look directly at the consequences of secrets left unchecked. And yet, behind those faces, there was no malice. They were not monsters. They were victims. Victims born into a horror they could neither name nor escape. The cruelty was not in their existence, but in the man who decided they would exist this way. Imagine standing in a room where 3 generations are present, but the lines between them are blurred beyond recognition. The daughter is also a mother, the brother is also an uncle, the father is also a grandfather to his own children. The web is so tangled that to untie it would mean tearing the whole thing apart, and still the cycle continued, not because they did not know it was wrong, but because by the time a family has collapsed this far inward, right and wrong no longer mean the same things. What is forbidden outside becomes routine inside. What is horror to the world becomes survival within those walls. But survival came at a cost. The cost was identity, language, health, and humanity itself. Each birth carried more weight than joy. Each new child bore the possibility of deformity, of silence, of a body that would not cooperate with life. And yet the father pressed forward, each night a reminder that in this house, nature had been rewritten to serve his will. This was no longer a family. It was a kingdom built on flesh, ruled not by love, but by control and fear. Those who stumbled upon the family in later years described it as if they had stepped into another world, one that should not exist in modern America. Lawmen, social workers, and curious outsiders all left with the same haunted expression. They spoke of encounters where the family would sit in silence, their wide, unblinking eyes fixed on strangers, as though unsure whether they were real. When they did make sounds, it was not conversation, but guttural noises, half-formed syllables, sometimes laughter at things no one else could hear. The visitors reported feeling watched not just by the people, but by the very house, as if it absorbed every word and carried it down into the earth itself. The father had long since grown old, but his presence lingered. Even after his strength faded, the traditions he had started pulsed through the family like a disease that refused to die. Sons had already taken the role he once played. Daughters had already been stripped of their innocence and turned into mothers of children who would never know normalcy. What shocked outsiders most was not only the physical deformities or the strange way of living, it was how natural it seemed inside the house. No one resisted, no one rebelled. It was as if they had been raised to believe this was the only order of things, the only truth they were meant to know. When journalists and investigators tried to document what they saw, many struggled to find words. Some wrote in careful language, describing the family as odd, isolated, or troubled, but between the lines you can feel their hesitation. They knew they were not just describing poverty or eccentricity, they were describing the collapse of human boundaries, the unraveling of something essential. To admit the truth outright was to admit that such a horror had been allowed to fester in plain sight, ignored by generations who chose to look away. And so the story was softened, blurred, hidden beneath euphemisms. But if you peel back those words, you find the same reality, a father beside his daughter, and the children of that act, still walking, still breathing, still carrying the scars. The tragedy of this family was not just in what they endured, but in how easily the world forgot them. Forgotten by neighbors, ignored by authorities, left to rot in their isolation. Only when outsiders forced themselves into that house did the truth finally bleed into public record, and even then, it was spoken of like a rumor, something too grotesque to fully confront. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because what comes next is the part people turn away from. This is where the story stops being about shadows and whispers, and becomes about choices that destroyed lives before they even began. You see, every generation inside that house was born carrying more than their own weight. They carried the weight of decisions made by the ones who should have protected them. A child born from his father and his sister, a daughter forced to become her mother's replacement, a boy whose uncle was also his brother. These are not the fragments of a nightmare. They were living realities for those trapped inside. The father who began this chain believed he had no reason to stop. And why would he? No one came knocking on his door, no law dared step inside, no preacher demanded he repent. Silence was his accomplice, and the world's indifference his shield. And so he laid beside his daughter again and again, until the line between sin and life blurred into one. Each child that emerged was not simply another member of the family, each was a monument to the crime. And when you looked into their faces, you could see the map of generations carved into bone and skin. It is easy to call them grotesque, to recoil at their appearance. But the real grotesque image is not in their bodies. It is in the father's shadow, still clinging to them long after he was gone. Imagine what it meant to grow up in such a place. To be a child whose only models of family were twisted by secrecy and shame. To believe, from the moment you could understand anything, that your fate was not your own, that you were born into a script already written. Every door out was locked, not with chains, but with blood. Even if they had wanted to escape, where could they go? Who would take them in? To the outside world, they were objects of curiosity, whispered about and ridiculed. They were never seen as victims, only as oddities, and so they remained, caught in a cycle they did not choose, but could never escape. Tell me, if this had been your bloodline, what would you have done? Would you have run? Or would you have been swallowed whole by the same silence that consumed them? Let me know in the comments. Because the truth is, most people can't even imagine what it means to inherit a nightmare. By the time the 20th century turned, most of America had moved forward, chasing industry, cities, progress. But in that isolated pocket, time had not moved at all. The family still lived in their collapsing house, still bound together by the weight of their father's sin. Outsiders came less often, and when they did, they left shaken, telling stories that spread like campfire legends, yet always with the uneasy knowledge that these weren't legends at all. These were real people, living, breathing, surviving in a way that defied everything we call human dignity. The house itself seemed to stand as a warning. If left unchecked, this is where silence leads. Not just poverty, not just isolation, but the complete unraveling of humanity itself. Some of the children lived long enough to see the world change around them. They watched cars pass their road, televisions flicker in the distance, airplanes carve the sky. But inside their walls, life stayed the same. Fathers still claimed daughters, brothers still lay with sisters, and children were still born into bodies that betrayed them before they took their first breath. To speak with them, investigators said, was to brush against the edge of something that felt older than civilization, as if you were hearing echoes from a time before morality, before rules. Their laughter carried no joy, their silences were heavier than stone, and their stares reminded you that you were not meant to be there, that you were trespassing into a world built on secrets. Those who documented their lives could never shake what they saw. One man admitted he woke at night to the sound of their cries in his dreams. Another confessed that even decades later, he could still remember the faces that looked human, yet not fully, as though the design itself had been smudged by too many repetitions of the same line. These witnesses carried the burden of the story because the family themselves could not. Their voices were broken, their minds clouded, their ability to tell their own story stolen by the very cycle that created them. And so the outsiders became their chroniclers, unwilling historians of a tragedy that the world would have rather left buried. What remains most disturbing is how easily it could have gone unnoticed forever. If no one had entered that house, if no one had dared to write down what they saw, the story might have dissolved into the dirt, forgotten as if it had never happened. And maybe that's what some people wanted, to forget. But forgetting does not erase the truth. The house stood, the father laid beside his daughter, and the children of that act lived, walked, and stared back at the world that abandoned them. In the end, the house did not burn, it did not collapse in some dramatic reckoning. It simply rotted into the earth piece by piece until only fragments remained. The family, too, faded into whispers, their names erased, their faces blurred in memory. But what they left behind is not so easily buried, because once you know their story, you begin to see how thin the line truly is between what we call civilization and what lurks beneath it. The father's act may feel distant, like something monstrous that could never happen again. But history teaches otherwise. When silence takes root, when communities look away, when the powerful use their power unchecked, the cycle can always begin anew. The story of this house is not just about deformity or sin. It is about the cruelty of inheritance, about children who never had the chance to be anything other than the evidence of crimes committed before they were born. It is about how easily society abandons its most vulnerable, choosing laughter, gossip, or denial instead of intervention. The true horror is not only in the twisted bodies of the children, but in the twisted silence of everyone who allowed it to happen. In the end, the family became less than human, not because of their blood, but because the world refused to see their humanity. When people remember them now, they remember the faces. Crooked smiles, eyes that never looked quite straight, voices that sounded like echoes from some other world. But beneath those faces were souls, souls that never asked to be born into such darkness. That is the wound that remains, the stain that cannot be washed away. To speak of them is to confront a truth most would rather forget, that horror does not always live in haunted houses or in stories told at night. Sometimes horror is inherited, sometimes it sleeps beside you, sometimes it carries your own name. So the house is gone, family is gone, but the echo remains, waiting for anyone willing to listen. And you have listened. You have seen what most people turn away from. You have walked into the most inbred house alive, and you know now what it held. The question is, will you carry it with you? Or will you turn away and let silence bury it once more?